Thank you. I am Pat Layton, and I am with Clemson University, where I currently direct the Wood Utilization and Design Institute, and I'm also a professor of forestry. And I have been a forester since I attended college back in the 70s, so I've had a long career in forestry. And I'm delighted to be here today. I'd like to first talk a little bit about how most of the forest looked as we started forest management in the United States. And forest management in the United States really only began in the late 1890s, early 1900s. So let's take a look at what the area where I live now, and in fact a lot of the East Coast, but this is actually the Clemson Experimental Forest, and this is a cotton farm. So when the forest began here, when we reforested the South, this is what it looked like. More importantly, for the Piedmont areas of the South, the soils were heavily eroded, and this is kind of the example of what looked like in the upstate of South Carolina. In some cases and this is our own forest, but in some cases these ravines are 3 to 4 times over my head, and I'm about 5'6", but they're 20 to 30 feet in height or in depth in these ravines. With the advent of policy changes within the Roosevelt administration, the CCC, the Public Works projects, and agricultural policy over the last 100 years, we've seen a change, and our first forests were put in the beginning in the late 30s and into the early 40s, and this is one of our early foresters, probably around 1948 to 50, actually measuring some of the first pine trees that were planted on our eroded farmland here on our forest. Today, this is what our forest looks like. This is a second rotation of forestry, and we use a very long rotation. Most of our forests are they're split up among 40-year, 80-year, and 120-year rotations, and this is probably a 40-year rotation, and we're well into the second 40-year rotation on this forest. But it happened all over the United States, and this is an example from Colorado. Since we talked about Colorado and the Intermountain region, I just wanted to give you a sense of what Colorado looked like. It was a naturally fire-dominated landscape, and this is the Cheeseman Lake area in 1900. The Denver Water Authority put a Cheeseman Lake in, a natural man-made reservoir in this area, and this was taken before that dam began. The picture in the bottom right is a picture of what that looked like in 2002. It was not heavily managed. Fire had been excluded, and in fact, many would say that for this region of Colorado, this was an overstocked forest. The Hayman fire came along shortly thereafter, and you see the devastation of that fire on the left, and then the reforestation and regeneration of forest on the right. So all of these influences, disturbances, be they man-made, natural fires, farming, all of these disturbances are predominant across our country and many of our forests. That's not the case in all forests, but even historic fires of the Pacific Northwest were documented in Lewis and Clark's expedition, and there are papers on historic fires of those areas. So we know that natural disturbance is a part, and restoration of those forests, be man-made or human or natural, are there. So now I'd like to look a little bit more at who owns the forest. As you can see, about 30% of the forest is federally owned, but 60% is privately owned. And they own 440 million acres, with private corporations only owning 147.4 million of those acres. These include some vertically integrated mills. It also includes a number of REITs and TMOs. And then there is a large amount of non-corporate ownership, about 298 million acres of that. And there are more than 10 million private owners of these forests. The highest percentage of these private non-corporate ownerships is the percent in family and individuals, and they average 22 acres or less. Private owners have differing goals for forest management, and in fact, many private owners don't do any forest management at all. So it does have a wide range of what they do with their land and how they're managing their timber. So one of the indicators of management is just, do you plant trees? And I think it's important to understand that of the forest in the United States, as you can see on the bottom left, total acreage, the number of planted stands in that acreage, there's less than 10%. About 9% of the forest in the United States are actually planted. Within that, the largest numbers are the southern yellow pines and Douglas fir, and for planted stands, and those are 53% for planted pines for all ownerships and 38% for Douglas fir of all ownerships are actual planted pines. The rest are naturally regenerated stands of timber. And if we explore a little bit in the private, corporate, and non-corporate, you can see that in the corporate, 75% of the southern yellow pines are planted, 72% of the Douglas fir is planted, and on the private side, it's 44% of the southern yellow pines and 24% of the Douglas fir. So there are government support for private owners to replant their forests and reestablish their forests so that we continue to have green up of forestry and not a clear cut that stays empty looking for many years and isn't gaining carbon by the growth of new trees. So there are active programs in that. Again, 95% of the planted pines in the South are on private land, and 66% of Douglas fir, planted Douglas fir, is on private land of some type. Taking a look a little bit in the South, I wanted to just show you sort of the differences between private corporate and private non-corporate. The one on the left is a timberland investment management group managing timber for investors. I'm not sure who the owners of this specific stand of trees are, but this is a stand of loblolly pine that was recently thinned, probably thinned the year before I took this picture. And if you look at the bottom corner of that, I'm standing in a logging deck. You can see some of the residue from that logging where they went in and thinned every 5th row. This will probably be thinned twice more before final harvest. And it will produce, this first thinning went to the pulp mill that's nearby. The next one, we'll see in a little bit about what they do with the rest of their wood. The one on the picture on the right is from a tree farmer in our state. This stand was probably established originally around 1990. In the forefront, you can see that the owner, who's very interested in wildlife habitat, has gone back in and planted mast and fruit-producing trees nearby his stand of forest so that they have an alley to drive through when they want to, and a wonderful source of food for the wildlife on their property. This particular landowner loves to burn and really wanted to produce that longleaf look to his stand, even though it's loblolly. But to the untrained eye, this would look just like a longleaf stand, given the amount of fire, and he burns this stand probably every 3 years. Very different types of desires for the outcome of these stands, very different management types, same species, same kind of habitat, same amount of growth, and really good growth. And again, the thinnings on these go first to the chip mill, or to the pulp mill, then to chip and saw, and then to saw log. So let's take a look at prescribed fire as an indicator of management. And we can see that prescribed fire is used around the country in varying levels, but it is a very important tool of forest management, especially if you're trying to obtain some types of stands, such as longleaf pine, but especially in terms of preventing wildfires. And so there is an effort now, I know in California, to increase the use of prescribed fire. There's been work there by the National Forest Service. And this data is available at any time if you want to go out and look at these. So these are kind of plantings. So the level of planting, the level of prescribed fire are good indications where you actually have active forest management within a state or within an ownership class. Now, taking a look at more of the economics of the system, one of the things that's important when you're working with forestry is you never want to transport water or air. It's too expensive. So when we understand that logs, as soon as they're harvested, they are half water. So wood and water are combined to make a tree, and about half of that weight is water, and we don't want to carry it very far. We also want to merchandise on site. So the entire tree is cut, brought to the front, brought to the logging deck. The yellow cat in the top picture is actually going down the log itself and cutting it off to where it produces the first log as a saw log. The middle of the tree is probably going to a chipping sawmill. And the top of the tree, which you can see laying on the ground on the left, is going to a pulp mill. Not all sites are merchandised equally, but trucks come into the site, load the merchandise wood for the appropriate mill, and send it directly to that mill. Products, if we can merchandise on site, it reduces the amount of transport that we're doing from another site. So it may get to another site and get merchandise before it goes on. So this really makes it very efficient in this system. The green machine over on the right-hand side is actually loading a truck right now. And the truck at the bottom is a truck of poles, that is utility poles that are going into the pole manufacturing plant to produce utility poles. And about 10 to 20% of our southern yellow pines coming out of our stands now, our managed stands, are actually producing utility grade poles. We reduce embodied carbon by first reducing hauling distance and the amount of fossil fuels we use in harvesting. Now let's turn to where the wood goes. So it goes to a sawmill, and in forestry terms, we use the term wood basket. That's the area around the mill from which logs are received. In the southeast, most logs go only 50 miles to a sawmill. More than 75 miles is rare for pine. It's not rare for hardwood, but it is rare for pine. And wood baskets can overlap with different types of mills. Just as I showed, they're merchandising on site. Different types of mills may be occupying the same area and using different products from a tree in the same wood basket. If sawmills are in a same area, there's either a lot of wood or you get competition from the landowners for better prices. The distance from the mill impacts the price paid to the landowner. If you look in the upper side of this, and I'm going to try to highlight it with my cursor, this is about where Clemson is, and our forest is almost 100 miles to our two closest sawmills. And so we actually get reduced prices for the wood that we produce on our forest. And our forest is not it's not funded by the university. It has to operate on its own products that are sold into the area. So the longer the distance, the more carbon emitted in transportation, the lower the price the owner gets, because again, about half the price of wood delivered to the mill is harvesting and transportation. If you go farther out, the price for the logs go down so that you can cover that transportation and harvesting expenses. Just to give you an idea of what that looks like in the Pacific Northwest, I pulled up the distribution of sawmills in the Washington State area so that you can see if there's a collection of sawmills, there's obviously wood in that area. And where you have lots of sawmills, you have lots of wood. And again, most of that wood is only going to travel a short distance to go into those mills, and the wood baskets are large enough to handle those. I will say that since 2009, the data on sawmills, the number of sawmills have gone down, and more efficient and effective sawmills have been built. So let's take a look at what efficient sawmills are like. So one of the things that sawmills have done is they've reduced their size of wood that they're using. So in the Southeast, only about 10% of the sawmills take logs that have butt diameter. So the biggest end of whatever is coming into the sawmill has got to be 28 inches or less, or it will not go into the sawmill. And that includes plywood mills also. In the Northwest, according to Forest to Market, only 8 mills take this size. So it's about 9% of the sawmills there. And what we are seeing is that the newer and more efficient sawmills that are beginning to open up in these areas are taking even smaller trees. So trees that are very large in diameter are not being cut and taken to these efficient sawmills. That's becoming a problem from some of our landowners because they'd love to grow big trees. And so we're going to have to think about how we get their wood to the marketplace eventually. But it's important to understand that size matters to the efficiency and effectiveness and price of product delivered out of these sawmills. The markets that are out there for big logs include the export markets and poles and pilings. And the picture you see here is the interior of a local South Carolina-based sawmill. And this, because we have a lot of crook in wood, we actually have developed saws that will actually curve with the tree so that it gives you no slope of grain or less slope of grain and gets you a piece of wood that's cut out of the log that will be best and most efficient and strongest. So we're developing technology in our sawmills to handle many of the problems that may have been associated with wood in the past. Once a log is sawn, it is sorted, and there are many steps along the sorting chain within a sawmill into which wood will get trimmed, wood will get planed, or it will get trimmed and sorted. And this top picture here is the sorter in a modern sawmill here in the Southeast. From that sorter, they will then, and so they're sorting by dimension and length, and then from there it will get stacked ready for drying before it's taken to a drying system. So the bottom picture is a stack of wood with separators in between each layer so that you can get efficient drying of the wood in this project. So there are all the boards from each log are sorted by variation, so it would be very hard to put back together one log. We're not going to be able to do that once it gets into the sawmill. We know where it comes from when it arrives at the sawmill, probably, but we might not be able to give you a solid stack of wood from one specific area. So dried stacks are planed and graded to standards, trimmed to enhance their grading, restacked by size for packaging and shipping. What we ship is dried, well-stacked lumber to distribution centers, which reduces cost and the use of fossil-based carbon. I wanted to just touch base on the marks that are on wood. This is the grade marking for Southern Pine. It will tell you who is the established group that's doing the certification of the grade marks. The item number 2 is the grade of lumber. Number 3 is the moisture content, and this indicates this piece of wood has been kiln dried and is less than 19% moisture content. And number 4, in case you need to know it, is the very important mill identification number. Every mill has an identification number so that every piece of wood can be traced back to the mill that it came from. Same idea in Western products. So there are more different, Western Wood Products Association is a certifying body out west. They have multiple species, so they will always tell you what the species, and this particular wood that I'm looking at on this mark is Douglas fir. So, and it will give you ideas of the mill that's there, how it's seasoned, and the moisture contents, all in those grading systems. So these marking IDs on the wood are very important pieces for you to understand when you're buying wood. Now, it gets transported from the mill the distribution center. So the mills are the red items on this, and the distribution centers are the black items. So you can see that the mills are located near the wood, and the distribution centers are located near where you're going to use the wood. Same exact thing for plywood and OSB. Again, in the lake states, you're seeing more aspen and other types of woods coming into these, so it's not all softwood, so you're seeing more there going into making plywood and OSB, and then we're coming back out and distributing to the distribution centers near the building areas. So from the distribution center, they can go to a local building supplier for a residential job, or they may go directly to job sites. In this case, the photos are from my next door neighbor's house. And so I went out and looked at when they delivered their products. They delivered OSB, they delivered studs, and they delivered LVL products coming from all over, depending on what the architect had specified and then what had been built or purchased to meet those specifications by the contractor. In some cases, and in this case, mass timber, which I'd like to speak to a little bit, the sawmill wood is delivered directly to the secondary manufacturer. These pictures were taken in 2015 at Structurlam, and this is Interforce 2x6s and 2x8s coming in for CLT, and then Kalishnikov is a different supplier they were using, and all of this, along with 3 other different manufacturers, were being brought into Structurlam to make both glulam and cross-laminated timber for buildings. So to give you an idea, this is manufacturing of mass timber buildings. The 2 buildings at the top are the UMass Amherst Design Center and the Plat 15 in Denver. The wood for these buildings were provided by Nordique, and the wood itself came to Nordique from northern Quebec, and they're assigned harvesting area. They have their own sawmill, and then they produce their glulam and CLT panels for the job. And you can look at the 2 sizes of the buildings and get a little bit more about what kind of amounts of mass timber went into it. The bottom building is the Quattlebaum building. This was just recently completed on our campus here at Clemson, and it is built with southern yellow pine. It was built by manufactured by what was IBX Lam, now Smart Lam, so I'll refer to it as Smart Lam in this. We had a mixture. It's a hybrid building, so it has steel poles holding up the glulam, and then we use glulam and CLT. So an idea of how we got the wood. The wood for the CLT came from 4 different companies: Canfor, Rex Lumber in Florida, Interfor, and Harrigan Lumber. And in fact, Canfor and Interfor both had different mills producing wood that went into these products. One of the Canfor mills also produced all of the lumber that went to structural wood systems for our glulam lumber. And then from Structural Wood Systems and Smart Lam in Dothan, Alabama, it was hauled to Clemson as cut pieces ready to go into cranes that lifted it into place directly onto our building. And the structure of the building was completed in about 10 actual work days, although there were some days off in the middle of that. So influencing carbon and wood products. Again, we've talked about use of certified wood sources, and thinking about that all the way through the distribution and manufacturing process is important. Remember that U.S. Forest Service wood is not certified, but it is well managed, and they do need markets for their wood. So using their wood is really important when we're trying to manage our forest to produce wildfire and other types of problems, pests, insects, things like that. Private landowners are important aspects of wood production. Landowners' objectives differ significantly, and they all produce ecosystem services which are critical to our world: water, air, habitat, and diversity, and almost every landowner will have different objectives. Not all lumber is equal, even from a single tree, and that's why we grade our wood and score it and mark it so that we can all be certain that the piece of wood we use on our building site is going to meet our needs. And then the idea of wood selection. Do we want local or not? That's an important point. So I will say on the Quattlebaum building, when the architect selected wood originally for trim and for our boat shed, he chose Western red cedar. I suggested that we use either ball cypress or white oak. We ended up doing that because we wanted to use local woods. We did not want to transport them very far. We wanted to reduce our emissions footprint on that. It's also important to start thinking about and looking at off-site and pre-manufacturing, and then bringing those directly to the site for construction, because that can reduce waste, it can reduce time, and really help in a lot of our opportunities for building the next generation of buildings. I also think another important piece that we need to think about in terms of wood is that wood is a naturally, while it's naturally can be used for reuse, and it is a renewable resource use, it's important to think as we design our buildings how we may deconstruct the building. So one of the issues that might be considered is, do we use a foam insulation or an insulation that can easily be removed from a building when it is deconstructed and reused? Another last wrap up, understanding trees and embodied carbon. Live trees sequester carbon up to a certain age, and then they don't. They produce more carbon than they sequester. They're still absorbing carbon, but they're giving off a lot more carbon at that point. Not all U.S. forests produce wood for buildings. Only a small amount of those forests produce wood for buildings. Ecosystem services are important from managed forest are critically important, and having those managed forests, understanding the needs of all of those ecosystem services and balancing them really helps all of our forest and our nation overall. Deforestation is not sustainably managed forest, and deforestation in our nation has mostly occurred when we change land use types or we expand cities and agriculture. Using wood, and when we're using wood in buildings, let's consider the whole life of the building and what that may be and how we influence the people who use the building and how they feel about buildings. And again, last piece here, fossil fuel prices dominate the economics of wood and lumber. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. Thank you.